Good morning and welcome to 365 Days of Amazing Stories with Theo Mayer. Here we are on day 153, and I'm continuing the story from 1001 Arabian Nights, The Adventures of the Porter, which is really the adventures of many more than just the porter. Remember that at the house of Zobeida, Sadie, and Amina, the porter had stayed to dine with them and celebrate life with them. And then 3 calendars had arrived and requested entrance, which they were granted. Now, you might wonder what a calendar is. Calendar is a wandering Sufic dervish. And they shaved their heads and their eyebrows and their faces. That was one of their ways of being, singled out for who they were. Now, remember that Harun al-Rashid, the caliph, had disguised himself as a merchant, and with his vizier, Gifar, and his head eunuch, they had gone off into the town, Baghdad, to see what was going on in disguise. And they had knocked on the door, Gifar had, and requested entrance. And Sadie had gone and asked her sisters whether it was okay for them to come in. And it was agreed that they could. And when they got into the hall where everyone was seated, Zobeida turned to them and said, "You can have all the eyes that you wish, but please no tongues." So basically she was giving the same message that she'd given to the porter and the calendars, that they were welcome to come and stay, but they were not to question what went on before their eyes. Now, they all got to talking and eating and drinking a little bit, but the caliph, he was just dying to understand what was going on. He wanted to know who the women were, and he wanted to know why these 3 calendars all were missing one eye. And it was really hard to restrain himself because he was the kind of guy that always wanted to know what the deal was. But because of the agreement that he had made with Zobeida, he restrained himself. And he kept himself from saying anything at all and tried to join in the conversation, which was a lively one. And it was about the many different ways that one can experience pleasure in life. Well, this went on for quite some time until Zobeida turned to her sister, Amina, and said, "I think it is time." And Amina got the point of what Zobeida was communicating, and she gathered up, or began to gather up, all the dishes, all the plates of food to clean things up. Sadie joined her, swept the floor, and they put everything in a tidy order. Now, what happened next was unusual. Amina had everyone sit down, and she had the vizier and the caliph and the eunuch sit on one side of the room, the 3 calendars on the other, and Amina beckoned to the porter to come with her. Sadie brought out into the center of the empty area a seat, and then went to the side herself. When the porter and Amina returned, the porter was leading 2 black dogs that were chained. And Amina took one of them, and she instructed the porter to take the other one out to Zobeida, who was standing in the middle of the room. Now, as the porter did so, the dog began to whine, and you could tell that it was very reluctant to go forward to meet Zobeida. But the porter continued with what he had been asked to do, and whimpering the entire way, the dog was led to Zobeida. Now, Zobeida had in her hand a whip, and she took the dog, and once the porter had gone and seated himself, she began to whip the dog and whipped it 100 times. And then she lifted the dog up. Well, it was standing on its hind legs, and the two of them looked into each other's eyes and began to cry. And after they had cried for some time, Zobeida took a handkerchief and dried her eyes and the dog's eyes and had the porter lead it away. And Amina brought the next dog, and the same ceremony was given to the second dog. Same treatment, beating, and then lifted up and looking into each other's eyes, tears being cleaned away. And the second dog was led away. Now, I can tell you that everyone that was sitting there began to wonder what was going on. The caliph, more than anyone. And he tried to sign to the vizier his inquiry. And the vizier was being very polite and trying to follow along with what Zobeida had asked, so he completely ignored the caliph. Zobeida stood in the center of the room, and eventually Sadie stood up and came out into the center of the room with a lute in her hands, and she told Zobeida to go and sit, and she would take her part now. And she began to play the lute and to sing an accompaniment. And she sang a few songs. And then Amina got up and came into the middle and said, "Sister, let me continue. You have done enough." And Amina began to play and sing as well. And she worked herself up into such a passion with her songs that when she finished, she swooned and fell down in a faint, basically upon the ground. And as she was doing so, she tore at her clothing to open it up and to give herself some air. And everyone was shocked, for when her neck was exposed, it was clear that the smooth skin that was so reflected in her face was not at all the case with her neck, for her neck was covered with scars. Well, while Zobeida and Sadie were tending to their fainted sister, you can imagine the caliph was wondering what was going on. And he tried to get the attention of the vizier again, who would not say anything, looked away from him. But he looked to the calendars and he walked over and said, "What is going on here? Tell me, what's going on?" And I said, "We have no idea." And the caliph said, "You do not live here?" And the calendars said, "No, we don't live here. We got here just a little bit before you. Well, we must figure out what all this is about." And he turned to the porter and he said, "You must be our mouthpiece. Find out what is going on." While all this commotion is going on amongst the men, Zobeida turns and sees what's going on. Amina has come back to her senses. And Zobeida says, "What is it that you men are all talking about in such earnest? Well, the porter comes forth and he says, "Ma'am, everyone is wishing to understand what has just taken place, and they have asked that I be their mouthpiece and ask you." Zobeida, her face becoming flushed, turns to the men and says, "Is this true? Is this true?" And they all looked at her and nodded, all except Gifar, the vizier, who was much wiser, it seems, than the rest. He wanted no part in it and was content to follow along with their original instructions. Well, Zobeida, when she realized that they were asking, she grew angry. And she said, "Is this what I get for my hospitality? I made it clear to you all in the beginning that all eyes, no tongues, don't ask questions. And here you are asking." She clapped her hands 3 times, and out from behind curtains came 7 slaves, sabers raised, and they threw each one a man upon the ground and stood above, ready to lop off their heads. Well, the men were quickly quaking in fear at what was about to befall them. They all thought their last moment had come. Zobeida looked at them. The porter, well, he began to beg mercy and said, I'm not involved with this. They only asked me to be their mouthpiece, so please don't throw the innocent in with the guilty." Now, he went on a little bit more, and Zobeida found it all so funny that, well, she kind of chuckled to herself, and she was kind of beginning to cool down, and she said, "Okay." She said, "Unless you all can truly tell me who you are and the story of how you got here, well, if you can't tell me, you will lose your heads. And if you can tell me, I will set you free, and you may go your way." Well, immediately the caliph began to feel somewhat more at ease, because he thought certainly once his identity was revealed, there was no way that he was going to be killed. So he turned to his vizier and he said, "Let her know who we are." Now the vizier, he looked back at the caliph and he said, "We are only getting what we deserve." The porter could not contain himself, and he immediately told his story, which was simply the story of having been their porter and having helped Amina out with purchasing food and bringing it to the place, and then asking to stay. And after he had finished his story, Zobeida, she said, "I know your story, and you are free to go, but make sure that we never have the chance of meeting again." Well, with this, the porter said, "Please, I have told my story, but it's not fair that I should have to go without hearing the stories of the others and without receiving permission to stay." He went and sat down on a cushion at the end of a bench. Now, Zobeida began to question the calendars, who all had lost an eye, and, well, the information she found out in inquiring we'll share in the next story, which will be on Sunday. Okay, hope you enjoyed. Have a good rest of your day.